Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Unit 2 of the Lunch and Learn series, and I'm looking forward to working with you for the next hour. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard, just a little bit of a logistical exercise here. So if you could type in the word clear under the question box there on the right-hand side, that'd be wonderful. I just needed to know that I'm actually being heard. Of course, this is broadcast all throughout Queensland, so great. Thanks, Joanne. Okay, anybody else? Good, thanks, Brett. Clear, goodo, thank you. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Anthony. Okay, anyone else? Okay, good. Looks like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is wonderful. It's always reassuring. Otherwise, as I said last time, you feel like you're you're talking to yourself, which isn't a great thing to be probably doing. You don't get much result that way. So we're going to be looking very much at influencing capabilities today. And what I want to do now is just review the program. Over on the right-hand side, you can see, sorry, left-hand side, you can see the order that I've changed now to suit where we're going with this executive approach. Obviously, I've had a few, well, look, I've had a few issues, logistical issues with our online survey system. I apologise for that, but I have endeavoured to send out paper and pencil versions to you. And, if you haven't completed them, you could complete that. The information is exactly the same. It's just not in electronic format. So sorry for the inconvenience that might have caused, but never mind. If you haven't done the survey, or the profile as I call it, you've got a chance to do this at the end of it. So it's kind of like doing it around the other way, I guess. You're getting the debrief today, and then you can go off and do the survey. So relax and enjoy. So there's our 6 modules. We're obviously up to module 2, which is enhancing your personal influence at the executive level. So there's basically 4 things that I want to cover in the hour. I want to look at influence as a topic, because I think a lot of people, when they hear the word influence, often think about manipulation or being cunning or underhanded or whatever. It's got nothing to do with that. It's certainly not in my book anyway. It's all about exerting influence in a willing and ethical way, and I'll explain that a little bit more in detail. I'm going to share with you the influencing capabilities framework, which is the model that the profile is actually founded on, and share that with you. One of the reasons I put it together, I wrote the book, The New Influencing Toolkit, was that when I was looking for some material on influence, I found that at one end of the scale there was lots of salesy type literature, which really wasn't relevant to local government, or wasn't relevant to anyone that wasn't in sales. And then at the other end of the scale, there was a bit of academic material which really didn't have any relevance to, or no practical application, if you like, to what you and I do each day. So that was the impetus for me to put together the book and to develop the diagnostic that I have, and of course the profile and framework. We'll then look at the 4 influencing strategies, and if you've done the profile, and you've probably worked out already which of the 4 strategies you favour, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Then what I'll share with you is some tools around how you might improve your influence at the strategic level, so that you may exercise some of the strategies that you might not normally feel comfortable exercising. So that's what we're doing in the next hour. So I just want to share with you these 4 people who feature very prominently in my book, and probably on first glance you'd probably recognise all of them. You may not necessarily be able to put a name to them. I think many of you would, but they might seem familiar with you. But I do ask you the question, what do they all have in common? What do all these people have in common, and why do I choose them? Well, I didn't choose them because they're personal heroes of mine, and that's important because I'm not trying to push any barrow here, and as you can probably see, I've tried to be politically correct by having 2 women, 2 men, ethnic minorities, white Anglo-Saxon. I've tried right-wing politics, left-wing politics, the whole lot. So I've tried to be as balanced as I could. But the obvious thing they've all got in common is that they've had enormous influence, apart from being famous. They have had enormous influence in the world. One of them's still alive, Al Gore, but the other three are dead. But all of them have had a huge amount of influence and impact in their lives. And I've used them because each of them have actually exercised one of the four influencing strategies that I'm going to run through with you during the course of this broadcast. So if you look at if we go clockwise and you look there, you can see that there's Al Gore, former Vice President of the United States of America and climate change activist. You've got Dr. Martin Luther King, who is was a civil rights activist in the 1960s, who unfortunately was assassinated in 1969. Then you've got Great Britain's first and at this stage only female Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, who was in power for 10 years. And then you have Mother Teresa, who has been anointed a saint by the Catholic Church in the last couple of years. So each of them actually exhibit a form of influence that's quite compelling. And each of them could be categorized as using one of the four influencing strategies. So I'll be referring to them later in the presentation. Okay. All right, I've got a couple of questions or comments here I just need to deal with. Okay, thank you. You're right. Thank you, Lisa. I didn't know you were late, but now I do. So does everybody else. Never mind. Okay, so they're the four that I'll refer to at a later stage. Now, there are lots of definitions about influence, and I think that, this is my definition of influence, and you can argue about whether it's relevant or not, but I would argue that influence is the power to make other people agree with your opinions and get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. Now, a couple of key words in there, obviously, power, and it is about power. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all dealing in power, whether we like to accept that or not. We all do. We are wanting people to agree with our opinions, or we want them to do something different, and of course that's what influence is. But really important here is that I want people to do things because they want to do it, not because I want to do it. Obviously I want them to do it, but I want them to do it willingly. In other words, to take on something because they feel comfortable doing it. And I don't want to be doing it in a cunning and underhanded way, and that's where the ethical aspect of the definition comes in. So I just want to make people perfectly clear about that, because some people have got funny notions about influence and it's all about trickery and all the rest of it. Well, it's not really, and I don't want it to be that way either. So we won't be discussing any of that sort of stuff during this session. I also want to make the clear point to all of you that you are in the business of influence. I'm in the business of influence. In fact, that's our primary responsibility. You as a senior leader or a leader in your organisation at a reasonably high level, in your local government organisation, you are actually paid to influence. You're actually paid to get people to think differently, and you're paid to get people to do things differently. And I think we've all got to accept that, and that's why this is one of the units in the program, is that we have to acknowledge that being good at influencing and persuading is actually our lifeblood. And so, I mean, I'm a professional influencer, obviously, in what I do, traveling around the place, presenting and coaching and all the rest of it, and writing books. But you're no different in the sense that you are wanting your team to come with you and take them on the journey. So getting good at it is really, really important, and hopefully this is what will help you with that. The other thing I want to say is that in any influencing situation, you'll find that there are three important variables. And I mean, obviously, these variables are critical to how successful you'll be in an influencing situation. The first variable is your own particular preference in terms of your own influencing strategy, influencing style and approach. What that means is that, and that's what the profile is all about. The profile will give you an indication about what your preferred strategy is, and if you've done it, you'd already know the answer to that. So you've got that. The other thing that's important there is that it's the other person that you're influencing. So they have a personal style and they have a personal approach as well. Now, we don't always know what that is, particularly if they're new to the organisation or they're stakeholders working outside the organisation. We don't often know. But the reality is they like to be influenced in a certain way. And I mean, we've all been in the case where we've tried to influence somebody, we're not getting through at all. And if we actually analysed and thought, well, why is that the case? It's often because their style and their approach is different to ours. And what often happens is in those cases where the glaze goes in their eyes and you're trying as hard as you can to influence, what you really need to be doing is to try a plan B. You need to try a second approach, because what happens is normally we just bang on endlessly with our particular style or approach and it doesn't work. So try something different and hopefully you'll be able to do that out of today. Now, of course, the third variable is the situation you're in, and different situations require different forms of influence. Obviously, if you have to make a quick decision, you can't really get your management team around you to discuss, because it's just not going to happen. By the time we get them all together in a room and we go around the table and we discuss it, it might be too late. So you just got to make a unilateral decision and then inform people later. So the situation's important. The key thing about these three variables is that you need to, if plan A isn't working, you need to move to plan B or C or D. That's the critically important point that I want to make out of that. So what you'll see on your screen coming up very shortly is the influencing capabilities framework that I put together in my book. There it is, you can see it now, and you can see that there's a push and a pull up the top. You see there are two styles, push and pull. Let me give you some descriptors around what they might entail so that you can understand the difference. Now, if you did the survey online, if you managed to get that done online, then you would probably note that that'll already add up for you, and you'll have a raw score here and a score here. But if you did the paper and pencil version, if you add up your investigation and motivation score, it'll give you a score for push, because those two are in the push style. And if you add up your calculation and collaboration scores, it'll give you a score in your pull style. So that can be quite useful. But you can see up the top there, the push style is about driving and proposing. It's about giving information. It's about taking ideas to the person, well, and the other way around. And of course, the pull is the opposite. It's enabling people. It's talking things through. It's seeking out information. It's defining, getting clarity. So which of those two styles do you favour? And of course, if your scores are fairly even, that's not a bad thing. It just simply means that you can fluctuate very readily between the two. Now, over here on the left-hand side, you can see logic and emotional approaches. So there are two different approaches. So let me get up a little screen that'll help you with that. So those of you who, and of course, again, if you add up your influencing, if you add up your investigation and calculation scores, it'll give you a score over here in the logical approach. And if you add up your motivation and collaboration scores, it'll give you a score in your emotional approach. Now, the reality is most local government, well, not most, all local government is run and founded pretty much on a logical approach. We have KPIs, we have structures, we have strategic plans, we have procedures for procedures, and it goes on and on and on. But don't be deluded into thinking that basically people are influenced only by structure and logic. They're not. And if you doubt that, I mean, we all know that on television, an advertisement might last for about 2 minutes, well, at that, 1 minute, and they only have one shot at getting you to purchase their product. And normally the way they shoot is very much in the emotional tug of the heartstrings. So obviously the world's made up of lots and lots of emotional influencing. So don't be worried if you had a greater score on emotion than in logic. It's quite common. In fact, if you split the world up into 50-50, you'd probably find 50% above the line and 50% below the line. When I say the line, I mean between logic and emotion. So you can see over on the right-hand side some of the differences between the two. Logical people like facts and arguments, fact based on rationale and structure, whereas the logical person talks more about values and beliefs and core ideas. And again, if you're communicating with someone that's highly logical and you're being very emotional in your approach, you're not going to get a good result. And equally, if you're quite emotional in your approach, the other person's quite clinical and logical, you probably aren't going to get a good result. So you can see how important it is to be flexible. And what that means is that you've got these 4 influencing strategies: investigation, calculation, which are both logical approaches. One's based on pull, one's based on push. And then you've got motivation and collaboration, both emotional approaches to influence, but one again is based on push and one's based on pull. So we'll look at actually what they mean in subsequent slides. Now, if you did the paper and pencil version, of course, you will have had scores on the summary sheet which indicate to you, your relative scores compared with all the others, and if you did the electronic version, you will get percentages. But at the end of the day, it's the same data, and basically what it's showing you is where your strong desires are around influence and where your less interested desires are. So if you look at this person, it's a real person. It's not me. But if you look at it, you'll notice that there's a fairly even score between push and pull. So this person's quite able to fluctuate between one or the other. And you'll notice on the left-hand side, they're definitely logical in their decision-making, more than emotional. There's quite a big difference there. And you'll notice that there are 16 what I call capabilities. 4 capabilities underpin each of the influencing strategies. So, for example, under motivation, you have building morale, connecting emotionally, generating enthusiasm, and communicating a vision. So you have all 4 of those, and all of those add up to the score that you get for motivation, and vice versa. So the key thing for you in this is actually to look at where your low scores are relative to the others. So in this person, you can see that I would be suggesting to them that they might work on their connect emotionally. They might work on that. I'd suggest that would be a good place to do some work. I would also suggest that they work on active listening, and perhaps getting shared ownership with other people when they need to take them with them on the ride. So the lower scores are actually more interesting than the higher scores, because they're areas that you've indicated on the profile that you have less interest in than other areas. So the likelihood is that you probably aren't using them to the same extent that you would be with other ones. And that's quite important. So have a good look at your profile from that perspective. What I want to do now is go in and have a look at the four different influencing strategies and come back to those four famous people that I mentioned earlier and actually look at how they like to influence in relation to their, what they've done in the world. So let's go through each one. So people who like to investigate, and there's lots of people in local government that are in these sorts of positions, of course, but again, I would suggest to you that you'd get probably a pretty even balance around the profile for if you were going to survey everybody. But the investigators like to marshal their facts and figures, and they marshal their facts and figures, and they make usually advance a very assertive case. They like to use logic and structure, and they tend not to do things spontaneously, but they like to consider their courses of action and get on and do it in a considered, methodical, fact-based approach. And Al Gore, the former Vice President of the United States, is just such a person. If you get a chance, if you haven't already done so, go onto YouTube and look at his video, The Inconvenient Truth, and sure, look at the content, but what I think might be of more interest in relation to influence is how he's actually influencing people. And you'll find it's graph after graph, statistic after statistic, photo after photo, projection after projection. It is a constant litany of stats, figures, and so on, because he's obviously trying to influence us by using the investigation strategy. That might be well worth having a look at so that you can get a bit of an idea of what that actually means. And of course, when he was in the White House, he was the one who was the devastating debater, and he was the one that had a lot of structure around a White House, which was led by a motivator in Bill Clinton, who was obviously below the line and a collaborator, whereas Al Gore was far more factual and logic. And some would argue that's why he lost the 2000 election to George W. Bush, because people saw him as fairly wooden and so forth. So I'm not sure how true that is, but I just thought I'd throw that in anyway. Okay. Now, people who like to investigate, if you think about some of the occupations that are out there, well, police officers, of course, that's their occupation, isn't it? They go out, they collect a brief of evidence, they charge someone, the charge is heard before a court of law, and if the evidence is compelling, then obviously whoever it is will of course be ultimately convicted. So police do that all the time. Of course, scientists and researchers use what they have a tendency to do is to develop a hypothesis, and then what they do is try and demonstrate or prove that that hypothesis is correct or incorrect by using a fairly methodical approach to do that. And that's pretty much what a scientist's life is all about. So strategically, when would you use this? Well, where you have workplace incidents such as safety or harassment or claims around that, you'd obviously want to do a thorough investigation. You'd want to talk to people, interview people. You'd want to do a number of things in order to get your facts straight, so that when the report was put together, there'd be a compelling case to be made. So it's important that in those sorts of situations, that influencing is best done, obviously, via investigation. And the reports themselves can be highly influential if they're done well. Where you wouldn't use this is where you're going to have large-scale change, where you want to take people with you. So you might want to take your team along on a journey with you about how things might be done differently. And, that's not a logical expedition. That's an emotional expedition. You need to win their hearts and minds to a new way of doing something, and we'll talk about how you do that later. But using facts and figures and logic is not where it's at. It won't work that way. All right, so let's go on to the calculator. So those of you who might have ended up being a calculator will relate completely to my description. Calculators like to promote the positives of their proposal, and what they like to do is to highlight the negatives of not doing what they think should be done. So there's a tendency that people know where they stand with calculators because they're very clear about where their position is on certain matters and issues. And so they're usually very good at debating, and they're very good at prosecuting an argument and refuting somebody else's argument. So the people in local government who would favour this approach would be constantly talking about key performance indicators, measures of success. They'd be measuring and monitoring progress and using that as a basis for making some recommendations about how things should be done differently. Margaret Thatcher was one of those, and people either loved her or loathed her. There was nothing in between with her. And one of the reasons for that is because she clearly let people know where the line in the sand was. And obviously, if you didn't like the line in the sand, you dislike her intensely. And if you did, you think she's wonderful. But either way, people knew. And look, I had a great example a couple of weeks ago. I went into Harvey Norman's to buy well, I didn't go into Harvey Norman's. I was walking past Harvey Norman's, and there was a sign on the door that said 40% off all laptops, and I thought, well, wow, that's I like the sound of that. I'm going to go in and have a bit of a look. And I went into the store, and there was another sign there saying must purchase by the close of business today in order to get your 40%. Now that's a classic calculation strategy. So they hook you in with the positives, the 40% discount, and they let you know clearly that there's only a limited amount of time that you can pay, so that's how that works. So Thatcher's one of those. Let's have a look at some of the characteristics about the calculators. Calculators are usually, you've got people who are in sales, for example. They, as I just mentioned, are very much into talking up the benefits and talking about the costs. Financial planners will often tell you that this is the very best deal going and never to be repeated, and you need to get on board, and this is the one chance you've got. Animal trainers, and I take my youngest daughter to the circus each year. We really enjoy it. She loves the circus animals, and when they're walking around, parading around, we notice that the trainer's got a pocket full of treats, and in the other hand is a whip. And the ponies get either a treat or a whip, depending on what they're doing. And of course, they use this pros and cons approach to train. And if you think about a good teacher that you had at school, it's highly likely that they would also use that approach. They know, you knew exactly where the line in the sand was, and woe betide you if you cross that line. So, by the way, guys, if you've got any statements, questions, comments, go for your life. We've got a lot of people with us today. So, go for your life. I'll be more than happy to stop and answer a question if I can. So where would you use this? Well, obviously, any new initiative in the workplace that's new. So you bring in a new system, or you bring in some new training for your team. You have to sell the benefits of that in order to get people on board. And so, the tendency is that here are the benefits for you, but you should also mention that here are the here are the consequences if we don't do it. So if you don't do, for example, harassment and bullying legislation training, then you could be in a position where you don't recognise what's appropriate bullying, and in which case you could be vicariously liable. So that might be one of the cons that I might talk about with not going. One of the pros might be that you can nip things in the bud when they start and get some good skills around that. So by doing that, you influence people to the realization that what you're proposing is actually in their best interests. Now, situations that are vague and unclear don't call for that because, people want the facts. They want to know why something's happening, and it's no point in you talking up benefits and features or whatever it is if you haven't told them exactly why something's happening. So that becomes really relevant. All right, so the mindful motivator. So the mindful motivator, we're going below the line now. Those two, of course, were influencing strategies that were very much based on logic, and now these two are based on emotion. So motivators will tend to use emotion, so they will talk about a big picture. They will link their proposal with the strategic direction of the organisation and talk about it in those terms. Motivators will often have a way with words, and they can paint a very compelling picture. So what's interesting about this is counsellors, will often fall in the emotional approach to influencing more than the logical, because to stand for office of any office, well, whether it's state, federal, or local, you've got to have a sort of a set of beliefs that you believe in, and so obviously it's more likely that it's going to be an emotional approach. But most people at your level in the organisation are probably paid to be quite logical and structured. So you can find that it actually creates a little bit of tension in the council chambers because senior officers are being very logical and the councillors are actually being quite emotional. So that might be something that you might want to have a think about as well. But Martin Luther King was the person who gave a brilliant speech in 1968, and it's entitled "I Have a Dream." It's well worth going to have a look again on YouTube, and actually look at it. It's a brilliant speech, but it's devoid of fact. And I know it's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that it's all about rhetoric. It's all about big picture. It's all about vision. And he does it brilliantly. But don't think for a minute you've got to be a great orator to be a motivator. You can tell a good story, and particularly a story at your own expense can be very powerful. And that can be very, very useful as well. So entrepreneurs, of course, entrepreneurs are clearly in that realm. They have a big picture. An Elon Musk or a Richard Branson, all of them have this tendency to be big picture, and they surround themselves with people perhaps who might be good on the detail. Advertising executives, PR and artistic directors and so forth. So when you would use it, of course, is when you are doing some strategic planning for your council. So you're putting together a new 5-year plan, or you're going back and rejigging the plan that's already there. What you're really doing is you're basically linking everyone to the big picture, the strategic direction or initiative of the organisation. So you might redo your values. You might look at your vision statements, you might look at your mission statement, you might look at your 5-year goals. All of that's up for grabs, and all of it's big picture. And then that cascades down, as I said, in Unit 1 to the next level, and then people start operationalising it. So if you are wanting to persuade people with a new initiative such as budget cuts, which of course, as we all know, is very common in local government at the moment. If you want to do that, this is not the right way to do it. People actually want facts and figures. They want to know the logic. They want to know the rationale. They don't want you to be linking them to a strategic direction. Unless, of course, that strategic direction is about budget cuts. that's a different story. So people want to see the rationale for it before they decide to become motivated. So finally, we get to the collegial collaborator. Now, the collegial collaborators are people who like to influence using emotion, but they persuade people by involving them in the decision-making process. So if you're a collaborative leader, then you probably find that it's easy for you to make decisions around the table where you involve all of your team members in that decision, and you then make the decision having involved everyone in that decision, which is a great thing when you've got time. But obviously, if you don't have time, you have less opportunity to collaborate. These people tend to be very good at building teams. Why? Well, because they're very conscious of creating what the French call esprit de corps. They're willing to build up the morale and maintain the morale in the team, and that becomes critically important. And Mother Teresa was one of those, and she spent her life in places like the back streets of Calcutta, working for the desperately poor and homeless, and that was her mission in life. And she was able to bring stakeholders and alliances together from government, non-government. She was able to get volunteers to join her, and so clearly her style was very much around collaboration, how we might achieve the end together. So a good example of that. So again, I'm not making judgments about any of these people in terms of whether, what you might think of them. So each of you will have your own opinion about Gore and Thatcher and Luther King and Mother Teresa. You'll all have your view about that. But what is important here is the style or the strategy that they used to influence was very prominent in each occasion. So guys, if you've got any questions, comments, observations, just launch in, because I am more than happy to take on board any questions or comments. You're very quiet today for some reason. Either I'm being very, very clear, or I've just lost you. I hope it's the former. But anyway, statements and comments are more than welcome. All right, so while you're collecting your thoughts about that, I think we should just keep moving. If you think about collaborators in the world of work, conductors of orchestras are clearly collaborators. Usually they stand at the front with a baton, or in some cases nothing, and they really try to collaborate with all the musicians to create a wonderful ensemble. So that's what they do. And funeral directors have to marshal resources and stakeholders, together on an occasion where people probably don't want to be there. So that's a tough gig that requires collaboration skills. You've got choreographers who are putting together wonderful programs with lots of people who've got huge egos, and they've got to do that by collaborating with each and every one of them to get the result that they want. So where would you use this? Well, my view is that you'd use it in circumstances. You might want to think about this, and we all know that local government is siloed, and we talked about this in Unit 1. You might want to get two departments together who perhaps don't see eye to eye, or there's a little bit of argy-bargy or lack of communication. So what about if you got the teams together and you started to collaborate with them around how they might actually work more effectively together? Would that be a waste of time? I don't think so. I think it would be a good use of your time, because the people that have got diverse views, or views counter to what other people think can be given an opportunity to speak at that meeting, and other people, of course, will be required to listen. And what you're trying to do is to navigate through all of that to come to a resolution about how they, together, those two departments, might work more effectively together. So that's certainly worthwhile. It's certainly not going to make it any worse, and there's a reasonable chance it'll make it better if you get the leaders of both departments together, or if it's a smaller council, then perhaps you might get, everyone in the room to communicate. So that'll work for you. But if people want to know the facts and the logic behind a decision, it's not going to work. So if you're introducing a new customer relationship management system with your customer services officers, as I know some of the councils here are doing, they're probably going to be very critical of it on the basis that they're very used to using an old system. But they want to know what the benefits of the new system are, and of course they want to know what the downfalls of not using the system are. So you've got to use more of a calculation strategy, initially at least, and once people are through that, then you can start talking to them about working together as a team and supporting each other and coaching each other and so forth. So that's an example. If you did the online capabilities profile, there's a page in there on this, and you can see that and consider that as well. Okay, so I won't spend much time on that. But what I would like to do, because we've got about 15 or so minutes left, and I do want to run through some very practical tools that you can use in your senior level, perhaps to be more persuasive and more influential. So, and of course, what I think you should do is look at your scores, and if whatever your relative low score is, so if it's investigation, which I'm looking at right now, then the job is to start working really hard on implementing some of these strategies in your day-to-day, because if you do that, you're likely to be more effective. So with the investigation approach, one of the key ways, and often underestimated, is to use a third-party endorsement. So if your council's going through a change process and you know that another council's gone through that process very successfully, then why not get the endorsement of the person that's actually taken the organisation through that particular process, and use them to add credibility to your arguments and weight to your arguments that we need to go down this road. Now, you might not physically invite them into your council to speak, but you might reference them. You might talk about them, verbally, and what their experience has been at another council, and people will be pleased because you've done your homework and you're referencing someone that's been successful in the very thing that you're recommending that people take on board. So structured interviews, which of course happen at the selection process for recruitment, of course they're a classic example of investigation strategy, because what happens is we all ask the same people the same question, and when we do ultimately make the selection of the best candidate, we can defend that on the basis that we have gone through a rigorous structured interviewing process, rather than just that person came across really well in the interview, so we decide to give them the job. Of course, some of you, and I know we've got a lot here who are in remote council areas, remote regions of Queensland, you don't have the luxury of, having lots of people lining up at your door to work. You kind of almost got to take whatever you can. I understand that, and it's perfectly valid. You may not be, but of course on the coastal areas, you've probably got a need to sort the wheat out for the chaff, so to speak, and that's where your structured interviews come into play. Any survey, of course, that's conducted, assuming, of course, it's conducted well, it's got a good methodology to it, will be an investigation strategy. And that's one of the reasons that surveys are so influential. And that's one of the reasons we've all got survey fatigue, because we're endlessly filling out surveys, and you're filling out one for me, and then you've got another one, and you've got another one, and it never ends. One of the reasons for that is that the survey data itself, if the survey's been done in a very practical, methodical way, can be extremely useful. And one of the things that I think you should think about seriously is process mapping. If there's an area in your business, which I'm sure there is, which you would like to improve, or it's got some real hiccups and needs to be thought through, one of the ways of doing that is to do what we call a process map. And I'm sure many of you would be even more familiar than me with process maps, but you draw out all the different steps in the process. And if you do this in a collaborative environment, so you've got your senior team with you, and you draw out, say, a process when somebody comes to the front office, what happens, where does the information go, how do we record it, and so it goes on. And if you drew that out on a whiteboard and you had your team with you, you are actually combining two forms of influence. One of those, of course, is investigation by using the process map. But the other one that you're using, of course, is collaboration, because you're asking everyone to be involved in the decision-making process. How could that not be successful, having those two approaches side by side? Very powerful. So I think process mapping, guys, is really a very underrated tool, and one that I think you in your senior role can certainly do more of. And what it does is it clarifies problem areas. It gives people a chance to think about the process and get their head out of their own area. It can be very, very useful. All right, so there's 4. You might want to think carefully about those and how you might implement any of those. Here's another couple, 3 this time, around calculation. By far and away, the most popular tool that people use in calculation is the cost-benefit analysis. And the cost-benefit analysis is where we calculate all the costs for taking action, and at the same time we calculate all the benefits for taking action. And if the benefits outweigh the costs to a considerable degree, then the decision is clear. Not only is it clear, but it's easy to influence other people to see that the decision is clear. So I would urge those of you who give presentations to council to actually think like that, as perhaps, in your reports, is to have some of the costs, have some of the benefits, and then make a recommendation based on a cost-benefit analysis. And I think your elected representatives will appreciate that, and it'll be much easier for them to make a decision, because ultimately that's your job, is to assist the councillors to make easy, informed and progressive decisions for their particular local area. So cost-benefit analysis are great. Of course, if the costs outweigh the benefits in any situation, then you've got a choice. We either try and bump up the benefits or minimise the costs or abandon the project. And I see a lot of councils looking at certainly community interventions through the eyes of a cost-benefit analysis. But there are 2 others that you might find helpful. One of those is the force field analysis, and a force field analysis is pretty straightforward. It's just like a cost-benefit analysis. On the left hand, you draw a line down the center of a page. On the left hand side, you put down all of the driving forces for change. So what are all the things that we've got going for the change? And then on the other side, on the right-hand side, you draw down all the things, or what I call the restraining forces for change. And so if you do this again with your team, you are actually introducing two forms of influence. One, of course, is calculation by using the force field analysis, but the other one, of course, is collaboration because you're involving other people in the process of designing this force field analysis, and then you will find that people will be completely committed to the answer, whatever that is, because you've, the old saying that people don't argue with their own data. They will be convinced about it because they were invited to have a view about it, and that is often enough. So that could be very, very helpful for you. The other thing I'd like to suggest is the after-action review. So every time something's happened, that you actually stop your team and you actually say to your team, okay, what went well? Now we always start with what went well because it's just a more positive place to start. And it doesn't matter how bad it is. At the end of the day, something would have gone well. And you stay there and hold the line until it does, even if it is a disaster. Then you ask people what didn't go well. So what were the areas that didn't go particularly well? You'll probably find that people will be more than happy to volunteer those because most of us are prone to seeing the glass half empty, not half full. And then the final question, and the critical question in all this is what will we do differently as a result of what we've learnt here now? It staggers me that people at your level in local government just don't do this enough. And yet it's such a simple thing that could take 2 or 3 minutes and make all the difference in the world in relation to capturing some key learnings and getting people engaged and influenced along a particular course of action. So there's 3 that you might like to consider. Let's look at the next lot. And I put down Steve Jobs' photo there. Some people ask, but it's really because if you had to categorize him around influence, and let's face it, he was pretty influential, I think you would argue that he would be not logical, but more emotional and quite forceful, and emotional and forceful, which means that he's probably likely to have favoured the motivational influencing strategy, and did that very well too for a long time. So here are a couple of things that you might like to try to build up your score here if it's lower relative to the other scores. What about doing a team values charter? Now, your organisation's already got values, so why would you want another set? Well, these values would be for your team. So you actually go around the table and ask 4 specific questions. Question 1, if there was one value that was important to you working in this team, what is it? Now, they might say respect, okay? So you go around the room and you get everyone to write these down, and then you get everyone to share it with everybody else. And then your second question is, how would you define that value? So I might say, respect means to me making sure that everybody has an input into discussion. Okay, so I've explained what respect is. Question 3 is, why is it important? And I might say, well, respect's important to me because I want to feel as if my point of view counts as much as anybody else's around the table. And question 4 is, what behaviours would demonstrate that value? Well, to me, doing that respect would mean that I don't interrupt other people when they're halfway through their presentation. I give them a chance to finish, and then I can critique it at the end, you see. So it's very powerful, and of course you collect all these values And what you do then is you put them somewhere prominent so that the team can refer to them on a regular basis. The GROW model is a coaching model. I don't probably have a huge amount of time to go through that in great detail, but really what that requires, GROW stands for, it's an acronym for goal, reality, options, and where to from here. So somebody knocks on your door, says, I've got an issue. Instead of you diving straight in and giving them the answer, which is very tempting sometimes when you're busy, is to say to them, before you go any further, what's your goal? G, in the model, what are you aiming to do? Now, obviously, if they have trouble telling you that, then they need to work that out. Then you say, okay, what are the barriers getting in the way? And they tell you a couple of barriers. And then you go O, so we're down to O now. Okay, what are your options? And they say, well, that's why I've come to you. Say, yeah, but if I wasn't here, what would your options be? And they say, well, maybe I could go and talk to so-and-so, or maybe I could do such and such or whatever. Great, go ahead and do it. Or whatever. And then the W is, what do you need to do next? Right? What do you need to do next? Now, you could literally have a conversation and solve a problem for somebody with 4 questions. What are you aiming to do? What's stopping you? What are your options? And what next? That takes you about 2 minutes. They walk out of your office with a spring in their step. They get a good result. You've trained them, and you haven't had to sit there and listen for 45 minutes of whinging. Storytelling. Obviously, storytelling is brilliant. And again, I know some of you think, well, I'm not very good at that. Well, it's not hard to tell a story. And we're not talking about a great work of art or something. I'm talking about a story where perhaps you made a mistake in the past and learn from it and share it with other people so that they themselves don't make the same mistake. Pretty straightforward. And then you've got good news stories. For heaven's sake, people, please start your meetings with a win for the week. Go around the group and say one win for the week or one positive for the week. It's a great thing, and it gets everybody thinking about positives. You're going to be talking about the negative stuff anyway, so we might as well get the win for the week out of the way. And you'll hear stories and you'll hear interesting bits of feedback that you've never ever heard before. And for a strategic manager, that's really valuable. And if somebody comes up with a gem of an idea, you can just simply then turn the conversation around to how could we all benefit from that? Okay? And finally, yeah, so that's it. So I think there's a lot of good things there. Last one, collaboration. Do what Stephen Covey suggested. Begin with the end in mind. And you can get a group of people together and say, this is what we're aiming to do, and we've got an hour to sort it out. So let's go. That can be a great way. It keeps everyone motivated towards the goal. We spent a whole, in the other Lunch and Learn series, we spent a whole unit on giving effective feedback because that is a collaboration tool. You're doing that with someone. Using a problem-solving approach with your team, getting everyone together and working with your team on that is very good. And if you are paraphrasing, that is, you're actively listening and paraphrasing, then that skill, although it's a micro skill, is actually a collaboration skill as such. So there's 4 things that you could do. Guys, we're pretty much coming to the end now. If you've got any last questions, I'm more than happy to talk about those. It doesn't look like it. Everyone, the cat's got your tongue. Okay, that's fine. No worries. Look, your homework, I don't think it's going to be rocket science what you need to do. You need to complete the profile if you haven't already. And I'll be sending you out the slides. I'll be sending you out the recording after this. Look, we've had a couple of people say they didn't get them. Well, look, they get sent out to everyone. I think what actually happens is they get caught up in the junk mail You know, like if there's 4 of you from the same council, your spam filters probably recognize me as some enemy, and so they send that straight to the junk mail. So check your junk mail, and if you don't do that, you probably find that you'll think I'm ignoring you. Here, a couple of questions here that I'll go through. Any suggestions on dealing with staff who don't think rationally? Grow doesn't work for them. Yeah, look, I think Grow's great because it's mixing both rational and emotional. So obviously, if you're asking people, because one of the questions that I ask people is, how are you feeling about dealing with this? Well, that's of course an emotional approach. I want to know if they feel they're going to really struggle. I need to know that up front. So I think it actually works. I'd be suggesting that you give it a good crack. We have a question, however. Our surveys came up with errors. We will be in contact. Okay, I can't do much about that now. Good session, Tim. Good reminder of the tools and their benefits. Good. Thanks, Ron. That's very kind of you. Thank you. And if you've got any other feedback, guys, you know where I am. You know you can get me on email. So the next contact you'll have with me is, of course, you'll get an email from me, hopefully, and it'll be the recording plus, of course, the slides. So that brings us to an end, guys. Thank you. I've enjoyed our session today. I hope you got something really useful out of it, and I wish you all the very best. And I ask you to go off and practice your influencing capabilities. Thank you.